A humble janitor died with $8 million while a high-flying Harvard executive ended up in bankruptcy court. In the world of money, your pedigree matters far less than how you actually behave. In a quiet corner of Vermont, a man named Ronald Red lived a life that gave no hint of the fortune he was quietly building. He spent his days pumping gas and his later years sweeping floors as a janitor. He drove a used car, lived in a modest $12,000 house, and passed his free time chopping wood. To his neighbors, he was just a frugal, hard-working man who stayed out of the spotlight. When he passed away in 2014, the local community was stunned to learn that this man, who had never earned a high salary, left behind a net worth exceeding $8 million. He didn't win a jackpot or inherit a secret estate. He simply bought shares in established companies and waited. For decades, he did nothing but let time do the heavy lifting. Far from the woods of Vermont, a very different story was unfolding in the high-stakes world of finance. Richard Fuscone seemed to be the exact opposite of the quiet janitor. Educated at Harvard and an executive at a major investment firm, he was the picture of professional success. He was featured in business magazines and retired in his 40s, seemingly set for a life of luxury. He poured his wealth into an 18,000-square-foot mansion that featured 11 bathrooms and 2 swimming pools. But this lifestyle wasn't built on the solid ground of savings. It was propped up by heavy borrowing and illiquid investments. When the 2008 financial crisis swept through the economy, the executive's world collapsed. His massive home and complex investments couldn't be turned into cash fast enough to cover his debts. He ended up in bankruptcy court, his success replaced by a public and humiliating financial ruin. These two men show us that financial success isn't like physics or engineering, where a person with the best education always gets the best result. It is a soft skill where how you act is more important than what you know. We see this contrast in the behavior of a brilliant tech executive who became known for a strange habit of skipping $1,000 gold coins into the ocean like they were common pebbles. He had the patents, the intellect, and the early success, but his childish relationship with his wealth led him to go broke. Brilliance is no protection against a lack of discipline. To understand why people make such different choices, we have to realize that no one is truly crazy. Every person looks at the world through a lens ground by their own unique experiences. A person who came of age in 1970 saw the value of their money eaten away by high inflation, which shaped a brain that views the stock market with deep suspicion. Meanwhile, someone who started their career in the roaring bull market of the 1990s might see the same market as a golden opportunity that only goes up. Neither person is wrong, they are simply reacting to the era they were born into. We often judge others for being bad with money, but we forget that the tools we use today are brand new experiments. Our collective experience with modern retirement is incredibly short. The 401k didn't even exist until 1978, and the Roth IRA wasn't born until 1998. As a society, we are like toddlers trying to operate a complex machine for the first time. We haven't had these tools long enough to develop any kind of generational wisdom. Even choices that look irrational from the outside, like a person with a very low income spending their last few dollars on a lottery ticket, make sense when viewed as a purchase of hope. For someone who feels trapped by their circumstances, that ticket represents the only moment in their week where they can truly dream of a different life. While behavior is the engine of success, there are invisible forces that often get ignored. Consider the story of the most famous software pioneer in history. In 1968, there were roughly 303 million teenagers in the world. Only about 300 of them attended Lakeside School in Seattle, the only high school on the planet that had a computer at the time. Bill Gates was one of those students. He has often remarked that if there had been no Lakeside, there would likely have been no Microsoft. This was a 1 in a million stroke of luck that placed him in the perfect environment at the perfect moment. While Gates's start was fueled by luck, his ability to keep what he built would later depend on a completely different survival instinct. This becomes clear when we look at his best friend from that same school, Kent Evans. By all accounts, Kent was just as brilliant and shared the same burning ambition as Gates. He was the third member of their early computer group, a young man with limitless potential. But before he could graduate, Kent died in a rare mountaineering accident. Just as Gates experienced a 1 in a million positive luck event, Kent experienced a 1 in a million negative risk event. Luck and risk are siblings. They are both the result of things happening that are outside of your personal control. When we look at extreme success, we tend to praise the person's genius while ignoring the tailwinds that pushed them forward. When we see failure, we blame the person's bad decisions while ignoring the hidden risks that could have tripped up anyone. Success is never as good as it looks, and failure is never as bad as it seems. Instead of obsessing over the outliers who got incredibly lucky, we are better off looking at broad patterns of behavior that work for the average person. The hardest financial skill of all is getting the goalposts to stop moving. We see the tragedy of this in the story of Rajat Gupta. He was a man who rose from being an orphan in Kolkata to becoming the CEO of McKinsey. By his mid-50s, he had a net worth of $100 million. He was set for life by any reasonable standard, yet he was surrounded by billionaires. In his quest to join that even more exclusive circle, he began leaking boardroom secrets to a hedge fund manager. He risked his reputation, his career, and his freedom for money he didn't even need. He ended up in a prison cell because he didn't know how to recognize when he had enough. Bernie Madoff followed a similar path of ruin. He had already built a legitimate, highly successful business that earned him millions. But the hunger for more drove him to create a massive fraud that eventually wiped out his legacy and his family's future. To understand why this happens, it helps to look at the game itself. In a casino, the house always wins if you stay long enough. In fact, the only way to actually beat the house is to exit the moment you enter. Wealth is the same. The only way to win is to recognize you have enough and stop playing the game of more before it consumes you. Contentment comes from realizing that social comparison is a battle no one can win. There will always be someone with a faster car, a larger house, or a bigger bank account. Chasing them is a recipe for regret. Having enough doesn't mean being conservative or passing up opportunities. It means having the self-awareness to stop before you do something that causes you to lose what you already have. As we navigate our own financial journeys, it helps to remember that some things are simply not worth the risk, no matter how much money is on the table. There is no amount of wealth that can compensate for the loss of your reputation. There is no investment gain worth the sacrifice of your freedom. No bank balance can replace the presence of family and friends, or the feeling of being loved by those you care about most. Ultimately, the goal isn't just to be rich, it's to keep your happiness intact. The earth didn't freeze because of a brutal winter, but because of a few cool summers where the snow simply refused to melt. Wealth works the same way. It's not about the big wins, but the small gains you never let go of. To understand the massive power of compounding, we have to look at the unlikely science of the Ice Age. For a long time, people assumed the world froze over because of exceptionally bitter, finger-snapping winters. But a meteorologist named Vladimir Koppen discovered a much more subtle truth. The glacier didn't grow because the winters were colder. They grew because the summers were just a little bit cooler. When a summer isn't warm enough to melt away the previous winter's snow, that leftover ice sticks around. The next winter piles more snow on top of it, which makes it even harder for the following summer to melt the stack. Over hundreds of years, these tiny leftovers of unmelted snow accumulate until the entire planet is buried under miles of ice. This is the ultimate metaphor for how a fortune is built. It isn't about one giant, spectacular year of returns. It's about the small, consistent gains that you never allow to melt away. We see this most clearly in the math behind the world's most famous investor. Most people look at Warren Buffett and see a genius at picking stocks, but they miss the most important variable in his equation, time. At the time of this telling, his net worth stood at over $84 billion. What is truly staggering is that $81 billion of that fortune arrived after his 65th birthday. He didn't find a magic formula in his old age. He simply started investing when he was 10 years old and never stopped for 7 decades. If we compare him to a trader like Jim Simons, the point becomes even clearer. Simons is technically a better investor by every mathematical standard, earning a jaw-dropping 66% annually compared to Buffett's 22%. Yet Buffett is significantly wealthier. The reason is simple. Simons didn't find his stride until he was 50 years old. He didn't have the decades of cool summers that Buffett had. In the theater of wealth, high returns are just a supporting role. Time is the lead actor that carries the entire show. While the numbers usually move in small steps, the greatest fortunes are actually decided by moments so rare you can count them on one hand. But to reach those moments, you have to possess a skill that is entirely different from the one used to get rich in the first place. This is the tragic lesson of the 1929 stock market crash. On the day the market collapsed, a man named Abraham German-Sky, a wealthy real estate developer, watched his entire life's work vanish. He was so devastated by the loss that he disappeared, leaving behind a legacy of ruin. On that very same day, Jesse Livermore, the greatest stock trader of his era, was having the best day of his life. He had bet against the market, and while others were jumping out of windows, He made $100 million in 24 hours. He returned home to a wife who expected the worst, only to tell her they were now among the richest families on earth. But the skill that made Livermore $100 million, taking massive risks and being a genius in the moment, was the same skill that prevented him from staying wealthy. Just 4 years after his greatest victory, he lost everything. The man who had conquered Wall Street ended his own life in a hotel cloakroom, broke and defeated. Getting wealthy requires a sense of optimism and a willingness to take risks. But staying wealthy requires the exact opposite: a healthy dose of paranoia and a survival mindset. It requires a barbelled personality. You must be optimistic enough to believe that the long-term future is bright, but paranoid enough about the short-term to keep enough cash under your mattress to survive a disaster. You have to be unbreakable so that when the world falls apart, as it inevitably does, you aren't forced to sell your leftover snow just to survive. Survival is the only goal that matters because it is the only thing that allows compounding to work its magic. This concept of survival is best understood through what are known as tail events. These are the tiny, outlier moments that drive the vast majority of results. Consider the career of a legendary art dealer who built one of the most valuable private collections in history. He didn't do it by being a psychic who knew which paintings would become masterpieces. Instead, he bought art in massive quantities. He was a tail investor. Most of what he bought turned out to be worthless, but a tiny percentage of his warehouse happened to be Picasso's and Matisse's. Those few tails paid for every single failure and created a fortune large enough to change history. We see this same pattern in the survival of one of the world's most famous animation studios. In the late 1930s, Walt Disney was drowning in $4 million of debt. He had produced hundreds of hours of film, but none of it was making a profit. He was on the brink of total collapse. Then came a single tail event, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That one movie earned $8 million in just 6 months, saving the company and providing the capital to build an empire. The same truth exists in the stock market today. If you look at an index like the Russell 3000, you will find that 40% of the companies in that list effectively fail over time. The only reason the overall market continues to climb is because of a tiny 7% of companies that perform exceptionally well. You can be wrong half the time, or even 90% of the time, and still make a fortune if you survive long enough for your tails to do the heavy lifting. But what is the point of all this survival and compounding if it doesn't lead to a better life? The greatest intrinsic value of money, the highest dividend it pays, is the ability to do what you want, when you want, with whom you want, for as long as you want. This is called time sovereignty. Psychologists have searched for decades to find the secret to happiness, and the most reliable predictor they found wasn't income, education, or social status. It was a sense of control. Having the power to wake up and say, "I can do whatever I want today," is the ultimate goal of wealth. A young man named Derek Sivers proved that you don't need to be a billionaire to achieve this. At age 22, he lived a frugal life and managed to save $12,000. To him, that wasn't just a number in a bank account. It was the freedom fund that allowed him to quit his job and spend his days as a musician. He bought his life back. We live in a strange modern paradox. Compared to our grandparents in the 1950s, we are significantly wealthier, live in bigger houses, and have access to better technology. Yet, we aren't any happier. This is because the nature of work has changed. In the past, most work was physical. When you left the factory or the farm, the work stayed there. Today, most work is thought-based. Because your tools of production are inside your head, your job follows you home. It's in your pocket on your phone, and it's in your mind while you're trying to have dinner with your family. We have more stuff, but we have lost control over our time. Ultimately, the purpose of money isn't to buy flashy things that impress people you don't even like. The purpose is to build a buffer between you and the whims of the world. It is to give yourself the freedom to wait for your tails to arrive and the peace of mind to let your snow keep piling up. True wealth is the ability to own your time and keep your happiness entirely within your own grasp. When you see someone driving a Ferrari, you don't think they are cool. You just imagine how cool you would look in that seat. We buy things to get respect from others, but those people are too busy thinking about themselves to even notice us. This is the strange irony that a valet sees every day at a high-end hotel. A sleek, Italian supercar pulls up to the curb, and every head turns. The driver steps out, shoulders back, expecting to be bathed in the glow of admiration from the crowd. But if you look closely at the people watching, they aren't actually looking at the driver. They are staring at the leather seats and the polished chrome, mentally placing themselves behind the wheel. They aren't thinking about how successful the owner must be. They are daydreaming about how successful they would look if they owned that machine. We spend our lives trying to signal our success to strangers who are too busy signaling they own to even notice us. We use wealth as a megaphone to shout for respect and social standing, but the message rarely lands. The hard truth is that while a $300,000 car provides a temporary boost to the ego, it is a remarkably poor tool for gaining actual human connection. True admiration, the kind that lasts, is earned through things that money cannot buy: humility, kindness, and empathy. You can buy the car, but you cannot buy the way people feel about the person inside it. To navigate this social illusion, we have to understand the fundamental difference between being rich and being wealthy. Being rich is a matter of current income. It is visible. You see it in the high-digit paychecks, the designer clothes, and the brand-new Porsches. But wealth is what you do not see. Wealth is the income that is not spent. It is the option not yet taken, the luxury car not purchased, and the stocks that have never been sold. Consider a man named Roger, a regular at a luxury hotel who became known for arriving in a different high-end sports car every few months. To everyone watching, Roger was the definition of success. He looked like a man who had conquered the world. But one day, the flashy cars stopped appearing. Roger showed up in a beat-up, rusted Honda. When someone finally asked what happened to the Porsche, he admitted the truth. The car had been repossessed after he missed months of lease payments. Roger had been rich for a fleeting moment, but he was never wealthy. He had the things, but he didn't have the money. This trap catches even the most successful people in the world. When the singer Rihanna nearly went bankrupt, her financial advisor had to point out a reality that seems obvious but is easily forgotten. If you spend money on things, you will end up with the things and not the money. Most people say they want to be millionaires, but what they actually mean is they want to spend $1 million. Spending $1 million is the literal opposite of being a millionaire. Building wealth is less like a sprint and more like a long-term diet. Being rich is like a massive, high-intensity workout that everyone can see you doing at the gym. But being wealthy is the invisible act of restraint that happens afterward. It is the result of suppressing the urge to eat the giant, celebratory meal after the workout. It is the quiet, daily decision to leave the food on the table so that your body, or your bank account, can grow stronger over time. Because we cannot see other people's bank accounts or brokerage statements, we rely on outward appearances to judge financial success. We assume that if someone lives in a big house, they must be doing well. But this is like judging a person's health solely by how much they can lift in a single moment, without knowing if their heart is failing behind their ribs. Real wealth is the silence of the things you chose not to buy. This leads to a simple but powerful lever for personal freedom: saving money. In the 1970s, the world was gripped by a terrifying fear that we were running out of oil. People thought the only solution was to find more massive reservoirs deep underground. But we didn't solve the crisis by just finding more oil. We solved it by becoming more efficient. We built cars that went further on less fuel and factories that did more with less power. Your personal finances work the same way. You have almost no control over what the stock market does tomorrow, and you often have limited control over your exact salary. But you have 100% control over your savings rate and the size of your ego. Wealth is essentially what is left over after you subtract your ego from your income. When you learn to be efficient with your desires, you realize that you don't need a specific reason to save. Most people are taught to save for a goal, a house, a wedding, or a new car. But there is a massive competitive advantage in saving for nothing in particular. Savings that aren't tethered to a specific purchase are actually a hedge against a world that is inherently unpredictable. In a hyper-competitive global market where everyone is chasing the next big thing, the person with a pile of unallocated cash has something much more valuable than a new car. They have the flexibility to wait. They have the option to take a lower-paying job they love, or to wait out a market crash while everyone else is panicking. Savings buy you the ability to say yes to the right opportunity and no to a bad situation. However, to keep those savings intact, you have to move past the idea of being rational. Modern finance tries to treat human beings like cold, logical spreadsheets. It assumes we will always make the mathematically perfect choice. But humans are emotional, tired, and easily frightened. We aren't rational, we are reasonable. In the 19th century, a doctor used a technique called malaria therapy, where he intentionally induced high fevers in patients to cure them of syphilis. On paper, giving a sick person a fever sounds like madness. Rational medicine says a fever is a sign of illness. But in that specific context, the fever was the cure. It was a reasonable path to a necessary result. Financial plans work the same way. A rational investment plan might tell you to put every single penny into the stock market because, historically, that produces the highest return. But if that plan causes you to lose sleep every night or makes you panic and sell everything during a market dip, then it isn't reasonable for you. It's better to have a slightly less perfect plan that you can actually stick to than a perfect plan that breaks you. Even the giants of finance understand this. Harry Markowitz, the Nobel Prize-winning father of modern portfolio theory, spent his career designing the mathematical models that run Wall Street. But when it came to his own money, he didn't follow his own complex formulas. He admitted that he split his investments 50-50 between stocks and bonds. He didn't do it because the math said it was optimal. He did it to minimize his own future regret. He wanted to ensure that no matter what happened in the market, he would feel okay. The goal of managing your money isn't to be the smartest person in the room or to have the most optimized spreadsheet. The goal is to be reasonable enough to stay in the game. It is to recognize that the social illusion of looking rich is a hollow pursuit, and that the real prize is the invisible wealth that buys you peace of mind. True success is creating a life where you aren't forced into desperate decisions, where you can sleep through the night, and where you own your time rather than being owned by your things. In the middle of a war, an entire unit of German tanks was destroyed, not by bombs, but by field mice that ate the wires inside them. This is the ultimate rule of money. The thing that ruins your plan is almost never the thing you actually planned for. During the Battle of Stalingrad, an elite division of tanks sat in reserve, a mechanical force of nature ready to turn the tide of the conflict. When the order finally came to move, the crews climbed into their massive, steel-clad machines and turned the ignition. Nothing happened. While the tanks had been sitting idle, local field mice had crawled into the chassis and chewed through the insulation on the complex electrical systems. The most advanced weapons of the era were defeated by a handful of rodents because no general in history had ever written mice into the official risk assessment. We fall into a similar trap when we look at the history of the economy. We treat the past like a map of the future, assuming that because we know what happened during the Great Depression or the 2008 crisis, we can predict the next disaster. But history is actually a study of surprising, unprecedented events that no one saw coming. It is a record of things that had never happened before, happening for the first time. Whether it is a global pandemic or a sudden market collapse, the events that truly move the needle are the ones that are missing from the history books right up until the moment they occur. Even the masters of finance eventually realized that the world moves too fast for static rules. Benjamin Graham is widely considered the father of value investing, the man who literally wrote the textbook on how to analyze a company's worth. Yet, late in his life, he admitted that the very mathematical formulas he had pioneered in the 1930s no longer worked. The world had changed so much, the way businesses operated, the speed of information, the nature of competition, that his old maps were leading people into dead ends. He understood that while human nature is eternal, the specific events of the world are not. Greed and fear will always be with us, but the next worst-case scenario will look nothing like the last one. Because the world is inherently unpredictable, the most important part of any plan is having a plan for when the plan isn't working. This is the concept of a room for error. It is often mistaken for being conservative or being afraid, but in reality, it is the only way to survive long enough to let compounding do its work. Consider the early days of Microsoft. Even when the company was booming and its success seemed inevitable, Bill Gates insisted on a radical rule. The company must always keep enough cash in the bank to pay every single employee for a full year, even if they earned zero revenue during that time. He wasn't being pessimistic. He was acknowledging that he lived in a world where mice exist. He wanted to ensure that no matter what happened in the global economy or the software market, his company would never be forced to close its doors. This is the same logic used by successful professional gamblers. A card counter in a casino knows that they have a mathematical edge over the house. But they also know that even with that edge, they can still lose 10 hands in a row. If they bet all their money on a single hand because the math says they should win, a brief streak of bad luck will wipe them out. Success in that game isn't about being right on every hand. It's about having enough chips to survive the variance of the losing streaks so you can stay at the table until the odds turn back in your favor. In your financial life, a margin of safety, like a pile of cash or a low-debt load, is your fire insurance. It is the buffer that prevents a temporary setback from becoming a permanent disaster. Risk is simply what's left over when you think you've thought of everything. It is the unmapped territory, the mouse in the tank, and the only way to navigate it is to leave yourself a gap between what you think will happen and what can happen. However, the world isn't the only thing that changes. You change, too. There is a psychological quirk called the end of history illusion, where we look back and see how much we have evolved since we were teenagers, but we mistakenly believe that the person we are right now is the final version. We assume our tastes, our goals, and our desires are now permanent. This leads to a specific kind of financial tragedy. Imagine an 18-year-old who decides they want to be a high-powered doctor. They spend a decade in school, racking up debt and working 80-hour weeks, fueled by the ambition of their younger self. But by the time they are 40, they have become a completely different person. The 40-year-old might value time with their children and quiet mornings more than a high salary and a prestigious title. But because they have invested so much time and money into their career, they feel trapped by a sunk cost. They continue to live a life that makes them miserable because they feel they must honor the choices of a teenager who is now a total stranger to them. The 18-year-old picking a career is essentially picking a life for a 40-year-old stranger. We underestimate how much future me will want different things than current me. This is why the most successful long-term strategy is often the middle path. If you work yourself to the bone for a massive salary, you might burn out before you can enjoy it. If you save so little that you have no safety net, you will have no options when your interests inevitably shift. Avoiding financial extremes is a way of being kind to your future self. It gives you the flexibility to change your mind without blowing up your entire life. To maintain this endurance, you have to accept a difficult truth. In the world of money, nothing is actually free. We all want the high returns of the stock market, the 12% annual gains that can turn a small savings account into a fortune over several decades. But we often forget that those returns come with a price tag. The catch is that the price isn't written in dollars and cents. It is written in volatility, fear, and uncertainty. Building wealth is remarkably similar to a trip to Disneyland. Imagine showing up at the front gate and seeing a $150 ticket price and 4-hour lines for the best rides. You don't call the police to report a fine for being there. You recognize that the high price and the long, exhausting wait are simply the fee you must pay to experience the park. In the world of investing, a 30% market drop is not a punishment for a mistake. It is simply the queue you have to stand in and the ticket fee you must pay to get the tenfold returns waiting at the end of the decade. The biggest mistake an investor can make is confusing a fee with a fine. A fine is a punishment you receive because you did something wrong, like a parking ticket or a penalty for breaking a rule. When you get fined, your natural reaction is to avoid the situation so it never happens again. But a fee is a voluntary payment for a service. When most people see their portfolio drop during a crash, they feel like they are being fined for being stupid enough to invest. They feel humiliated and angry, and they run away to avoid the pain. But if you can shift your mindset to see that volatility as a fee, everything changes. You realize that the fear and the sleepless nights are just the cost of admission for a better future. There is no such thing as a free lunch in finance. Investors who try to avoid the fee, by trying to time the market or jumping in and out of safe funds, usually end up paying a much larger fine in the form of lost compounding and missed opportunities. We saw this play out with a giant like General Electric. For years, the company seemed to perform a miracle of perfectly smooth, rising earnings. They used accounting tricks to hide the natural bumps and bruises of business, giving investors the illusion that they had found a way to get returns without paying the price of volatility. But in 2008, the bill finally came due. The free lunch vanished, and the subsequent collapse was catastrophic because the company hadn't been honest about the true cost of its success. The only way to win a game dictated by compounding is to make sure you never, ever have to stop playing. If you are spread too thin or locked into a rigid path, a single surprise, either from the world or from your own heart, can force you to quit. The ultimate price of wealth is the emotional endurance to pay the fee of uncertainty without running away. It is the willingness to stand in the long lines, to endure the cool summers where the snow won't melt, and to keep your eyes on the horizon while everyone else is looking at their feet. If you can pay that price, the gates to financial freedom will eventually swing open. An alien looking at New York City in 2007 and 2009 would see the same buildings and the same people. But in those 2 years, $16 trillion simply vanished. Nothing physical changed. The only thing that broke was the story we told ourselves about the world. If that alien hovered over Manhattan, it would see the same steel beams, the same subway tracks, and the same millions of laptops humming with the same processing power. The city didn't get hit by a meteor, the factories didn't burn down, and the workforce didn't suddenly lose its skills. Yet, the collective wealth of the country cratered. This happened because money is not just a collection of cold, hard assets. It is a narrative driven by belief. When the story shifted from one of infinite growth to one of systemic collapse, the value followed the story into the abyss. We live in a world where we create complex financial models to explain the past, but we often forget that the most powerful force in the market is the tale we tell each other about the future. To understand why these stories become so volatile, we have to recognize that we are not all playing the same game. Financial bubbles are often dismissed as simple products of greed, but they are actually the result of a specific kind of social cross-contamination. Imagine a long-term investor who buys a stock in a tech company, planning to hold it for 30 years. To this person, a price that is 60 times the company's earnings looks like a dangerous, crazy bubble. But across the street, a day trader is buying that same stock. That trader doesn't care about the next 30 years. They only care about the next 10 minutes. If the price goes up by 1%, they win. For the day trader, the high price isn't crazy, it's just momentum. The disaster begins when the long-term investor starts taking cues from the day trader. They see the price rising and think they are missing out, forgetting that their goals and their timelines have nothing in common with the person driving the price up. It is like a marathon runner trying to keep pace with a 100-meter sprinter. The runner will collapse because they are trying to play a game their body wasn't prepared for. The most important rule in finance is to define your own time horizon and never take financial advice or social cues from someone playing a different game than you. While we try to stay focused on our own path, we are constantly bombarded by the seduction of pessimism. In the world of media and intellectual debate, pessimism simply sounds smarter. If you stand up and say that the world will be 20% better in a decade, people will dismiss you as a naive dreamer or a salesman. But if you stand up and warn that a catastrophic crash is around the corner, people will lean in, take notes, and call you a visionary. There is an inherent intellectual superiority to doom and gloom because of the way progress and destruction move at different speeds. In 1903, the Wright brothers achieved the first flight in history. It was a monumental shift in human capability, yet for several years, almost no one noticed. Real progress is a slow, quiet accumulation of small wins that are too boring to make the evening news. Destruction, however, is fast and urgent. A market crash happens in a week, a terrorist attack happens in a second, a pandemic spreads in a month. This speed difference makes pessimism feel more real and more sophisticated, even though optimism has historically been the much more accurate bet for the long-term survivor. We gravitate toward these dark stories because we have a deep-seated need to feel in control of a random world. We hate admitting that the economy is a chaotic system influenced by billions of unpredictable human decisions. To fill the gaps in our understanding, we create appealing fictions. We listen to economists give precise forecasts for the next 18 months, and we follow analysts who claim to know exactly where the price of gold will be by December. We know deep down that these people cannot see the future, but we listen anyway because a false story is more comforting than the cold truth that no one is in charge. We would rather believe a lie that provides a sense of certainty than admit that the world is a series of unknown unknowns. This need for a coherent story explains why we fall for scams or ignore red flags when we are desperate. If a person feels they have fallen behind and urgently needs a 20% return to retire, their brain will begin to find reasons to believe a story that promises that return, no matter how unrealistic it is. We believe what we need to be true. Our financial choices are rarely about what is right on a spreadsheet and almost always about what satisfies the narrative we need to tell ourselves to get through the day. This realization leads to a fundamental shift in how we should approach financial advice. Consider the case of Clarence Hughes, a doctor who realized that his job wasn't just to provide the mathematically best treatment to a patient. If a treatment is 10% more effective but causes the patient so much pain that they quit the program halfway through, it is a failure. The best treatment is the one the patient can actually tolerate. Managing money is a personal prescription, not a universal law. This is why some of the most successful financial thinkers make choices that look anti-rational on paper. Morgan Housel, the author of these insights, admits to a strategy that would make many math-based advisors cringe. He chose to pay off his mortgage early, despite the fact that his interest rate was so low that the rational move would have been to keep the loan and invest the extra cash in the stock market. On a spreadsheet, he lost money by paying it off. But in his life, he gained something far more valuable, a sense of total independence and the peace of mind that comes from knowing he and his family own the roof over their heads, no matter what happens to the global economy. Housel keeps roughly 20% of his net worth in cash, an amount that many would see as a drag on his potential returns. He doesn't do this because he is waiting for a market crash to buy the dip. He does it because it is the fire insurance that allows him to sleep at night. He puts 100% of his remaining investments into simple, low-cost index funds. He isn't trying to beat the market or prove he is the smartest person in the room. He is simply trying to be independent. His strategy isn't designed for maximum returns. It is designed for maximum endurance. He wants to ensure that he never has to stop playing the game of compounding. This search for independence is often a reaction to the social race we have been running since the end of World War II. In the 1950s, the American economy was designed in a way that made everyone feel like they were on the same team. The gap between the CEO and the worker was smaller, and the American dream was a standardized story that almost everyone could follow. But as the decades passed, that story broke. The gap widened, and the pressure to keep up with the Joneses turned into a debt-fueled crisis. We began measuring our worth by the things we could see, the cars and the houses, while ignoring the invisible wealth that actually provides security. We have spent generations trapped in a culture that tells us more is the only valid goal. We have been taught to chase the highest return, the biggest title, and the flashiest lifestyle. But the history of the US consumer shows that this path leads to a fragile existence where a single cool summer or a few mice in the tank can ruin everything. We have forgotten that the true purpose of money is not to impress others, but to buy back the right to your own life. There is no single right way to manage money. The only right way is the one that allows you to sleep at night and gives you the freedom to own your time. Your financial plan does not need to make sense to a Harvard MBA or a billionaire hedge fund manager. It only needs to make sense to you and your family. The ultimate goal is not to be the richest person in the graveyard, but to have the freedom to live a life that makes sense to you. When you stop playing other people's games and start writing your own story, you realize that true wealth is the ability to walk away from the race and finally own your future.